Buenos días. CABE, it's good to be back. Thank you for inviting me again. I was supposed to be here 2 years ago, but the weather didn't permit. So I'm glad to be back once again and see so many old friends, former students. It's good to be back in California. I just got back here in September. I think it's a good sign. It's raining. So hopefully it means the drought is over. Not just the drought in terms of the water, but the drought in terms of ideas, the drought in terms of bad policies. When I left California in 2000, we had just passed Prop 209, the ban on affirmative action, Prop 187, the attempt at stripping rights away from the undocumented, and Prop 227. It was a trifecta of bad policies. And we had just elected Gray Davis. Some of you might remember him. That was brief, wasn't it? Right? And I, like many of you, had hoped that finally a governor who said he was going to make education priority would begin to change things, because in the 20 years that I'd been here, I saw California go from one of the first in per pupil spending to down toward the bottom. And a host of bad policies on K-12, which had us stripping away so many of the critical resources our kids need. And Gray Davis came in and he brought us standards and accountability. He's ahead of the curve. And so everywhere I went, I proceeded to criticize Gray Davis. And finally, someone from his office came to see me. And they said, well, we hear you've been very critical of the governor, and we want to know why and what you think the governor should be doing. I said, well, the governor could do a lot. I said, why don't he start by building some more schools, because our schools are overcrowded. I said, and then why doesn't he continue by at least paying the teachers what he's paying the prison guards? Right? Well, that didn't happen. And Gray didn't stay in office, and the bad policies continued. So I'm hoping now that there is a sign of change in California. The need for change is clear. California is not a broke state. California is a cheap state. Right? California has refused deliberately to invest in its children. Right? You can't be home to Silicon Valley and Hollywood and agribusiness and then say there's no money for education. Right? In LA County, we spend $237,000 a year to incarcerate a juvenile. We spend $11,000 to educate one. Something is wrong with these priorities. The investments are going completely in the wrong direction. And so I'm glad to see CABE, again, a leader in the field, boldly calling for a shift in direction. And now we need to make sure the politicians follow. Right? I realized a long time ago, politicians are not leaders. They're followers. They look at polls, and then they try to get out ahead of the polls. And right now, we know the politics facing the country are bizarre and dangerous. Right? Bizarre and dangerous. You know, we are one of the few countries in the world that takes pride in only speaking one language, right? And not very well. Right? I get to travel around the world, and I go to a place like Curacao. Curacao, the average person speaks 4 languages. Spanish, Dutch, papamiento, English. They're not even related, and they think that's normal, right? All over Europe, you see people speaking multiple languages. In Africa, Asia. I was on a panel recently in San Diego with some students. And yeah, San Diego. San Diego's doing good things right now, so I wanted to watch San Diego. Watch San Diego. And a student from Vietnam was explaining how she was struggling with her Spanish class, which is required for graduation. And she said, I wish that the district would give me credit for the 5 other languages I speak. And I turned to the superintendent and said, maybe you should, right? Maybe you should. Maybe we need to acknowledge that the cultural diversity of our children, that the language they bring is a resource and not a deficit. You know, the Superintendent Gundry, did I get it right? Started with his bilingual story. Let me start with mine. My father's from Venezuela, my mother's from Jamaica, born in New York. That only happens in New York, you know, that combination. Father, a Spanish speaker, mother, an English speaker, so we spoke English at home. We moved from Brooklyn to Long Island, thinking that we were going to get into better schools. But when we get to schools in Long Island, the district looks at our names and assumes we're Spanish speakers and therefore assumes we should be in special education. Okay. Because that's the equation in many places still, that not speaking English is actually a disability. So both my brother Felipe and I are placed in special ed. I'm only 6 at the time, so I'm okay with it. We're just coloring, it's no problem. My brother Felipe is older, so he knows something's wrong, so he goes home to tell my parents I'm in the wrong class. But being immigrant parents, what do they say? They say, behave yourself and do what you're told. Because immigrant parents trust the schools at their own peril. And the next day he comes back and he says again, Papi, I'm definitely in the wrong class. My father again says, look, pow pow, right? Because we don't play. So the next day he comes and it's a paper airplane and he shows it to my mother and she says, what's this? She said, that's what I did yesterday. So then he says, okay. My father was a police officer in New York City. He says, I better come to school in uniform. Right? So he shows up and he says, I want to see the class my sons are in. And I said, you don't need to see the class. This is a very good school district. We know what we're doing. We've got them in the right class. He said, no, I want to see the class. I want to see what's going on. So reluctantly, they take him and he sees and they see nothing is going on because special ed is a holding tank for children they don't want to serve or don't know how to serve. And so he insists right away that we get moved. They said, well, we'll have to test them then. He said, we'll test them. So they test us. And according to their test, now instead of being special ed, we're gifted. My brother Felipe ends up going to Harvard. I end up going to Brown. What would have happened had my parents not intervened? You know, I'm glad to hear their parents today because when parents do not intervene, when parents do not watch, when parents do not hold the schools accountable, right, that's the accountability we should be after. Right? Very often the children don't get what they need and deserve. One of the things they need is the opportunity to engage in deeper learning. Okay? I know the Common Core has become a bad word out there politically. They think it's Obamacare for education. Right? Most of the people who criticize it don't even know what it is. Right? I'm not against the Common Core standards. I am against applying the assessments before you've actually trained anybody and gotten anybody ready. I hope John King, who you heard from, learned a lesson after the disaster he created in New York, right? Because that's what he did there. That's why New York had more parents opting out of testing than any other state in the country. I was asked to sign a petition calling for him not to be appointed. I didn't. I'm glad to see a black Puerto Rican as the Secretary of Education. But I know this takes more than having the right identity to make the right policies. Right? So we need to make sure, though, that even in our recognition that we've been using assessment wrong, and we have. We've been using assessment as a weapon, not as a tool. We've been using assessment to rank kids, to rank schools, to threaten teachers, to shut down schools, instead of as a way to make sure that our kids get what they need, right, which is what we should be doing, to diagnose learning needs. But the standards themselves make sense. And the standards actually offer an opportunity to bring equity into our schools in a very, very profound way. And so that's what I want to spend some time talking about with you today is how do we pursue equity in education at a time of such profound inequality and at a time of such overt hostility towards immigrants? Because we know that that's in the air, and it's in our schools, and it's in our communities. We know that there are families that feel like fugitives and children who are feeling the strains of the environment we're in. And so I don't want to pretend that doing equity work is easy, but I want to say it's essential. It's essential because if we don't figure out how to address the needs of all our kids, and by needs, I'm talking about both academic, psychological, emotional, and social needs, because you can't separate the academic from the other needs. It's all in the same person. Then what ends up happening is those with the greatest needs continue to be the kids least likely to thrive. You know, we're starting to realize slowly trauma is a need. Trauma affects our kids. You know that there is research showing that we have children in cities throughout the country that have higher rates of trauma than veterans returning from Afghanistan. Right? And it affects their ability to concentrate, it affects their ability to learn. It has a huge impact on their development as children. So we also have to recognize that our kids are not all the same. They learn in different ways, they learn at different paces. Equity is about understanding how to meet the needs. That's why it can't be reduced to a slogan. You know, we've lived with so many good slogans, haven't we? No child left behind. That was a great slogan. Except when Marion Wright Edelman came up with it, not the Bush administration, Marion Wright Edelman and the Children's Defense Fund came up with the slogan, leave no child behind. They didn't mean you should test the children as frequently as possible. Right? They meant you had to focus on health and nutrition and safety and all the things that we know, the things that Abraham Maslow said were the basis of child development. But somehow that's not part of the policy. And now we have a new law, every student succeeds. Another good slogan. No strategy to how to make them succeed, and no guidance to the states on what they should do differently. And now I see states all around the country with greater freedom not knowing what to do because every single State Department of Education in the United States is organized for compliance, not organized to help schools improve. We don't know how to do that. We know how to tell them they're failing, right? So we can put letter grades. Right? That was a great Jeb Bush intervention, right? They decided they're going to put letter grades on schools in Florida. So you can go to any school in Florida and you can find an A school all the way down to an F school. I would say if a school is designated an F school by the state of Florida and they still allow children to go, the state should be sued, right? I went to Edison High School in Miami, a triple F school. I asked the principal, how do you get to be triple F? He said, well, you simply fail the state exam 3 years in a row. I said, what happens if you fail again? He said, we will fail because 85% of our kids don't speak English, haven't been in the country long enough to learn it. They're required to take an exam in English in less than 2 years. I said, well, what happens if you become a quadruple F school? He said, well, now the state says they'll take us over. I said, are you worried about being taken over? He said, not at all. He said, I'm quitting at the end of this year, first of all. And you should know everyone described him as committed, hardworking, but beaten down, right, by a system that just crushes people. He said, the crazy thing is the state can't take us over because there are too many schools just like us. He said, what's more, does the state of Florida know what to do if they took control? Is there some secret recipe they've been holding back on now for schools like Edison? What's the record of state takeovers across the country? It's one of complete failure. Complete failure. Compton was under state control for how long? Is it now the model for California? Right. Every urban district in New Jersey is under state control with the exception of Elizabeth. When's the last time you heard Governor Christie take responsibility for his failing schools that he's in charge of? We have an accountability system that holds those with the most power the least accountable. It makes no sense. We have a population change taking place. At the same time, we have deep inequity. So as Latinos are the fastest growing population, they are also still the population that is lagging behind in education. And because they're lagging behind in education, Latinos are also lagging behind in wages, which means that many Latinos across the country, not just in California, but across the country, are stuck in permanent low-wage jobs. That's the scenario. Education's got to play a role in changing that. And we can't afford to wait until we elect the right person as president or governor, because the fact is, we have a bipartisan problem in education. The Democrats have been no better. They've come up with the same. Race for the top was a disaster. Right? It was No Child Behind on steroids. And so what we need is to make sure that we focus on equity, that we really focus on using assessment to help our children develop language proficiency in both languages or more. Because children need their primary language, don't they? We need to make sure that we are not dumbing down the curriculum for those we think don't have the potential because of some measure of their ability, which is typically what we do, isn't it? We not only dumb down the curriculum, but we also sort the teachers. We save the so-called best teachers for which kids? The ones we think are the most advanced, and we said the newest teachers, the least experienced teachers, the kids with the greatest needs. Right? Show me the research to support that strategy. There is none. We confuse the performance of our kids on standardized tests with their actual ability. Right? We don't even know if the kids actually made an effort. We don't even know if they know how to type when they're typing in their answers. We don't know what the scores mean. But we treat the score as though it actually tells us something about a child's ability and potential, because we are using the assessments in the wrong ways. And so we're going to have to make sure that we make high standards available to all children, and we give teachers clear guidance and support on how to do the work. We shouldn't send teachers into the classroom like Superintendent Gundry was sent, with no guidance, no support. Say, teach these kids. That's exactly what we're doing in many of these schools. And we shouldn't be surprised that we end up with long-term L's. Right? You know about the long-term L's, the kids who never learn English and then lose their language, their primary language too? So now they end up semi-literate in 2 languages. That's a disability. That's a serious disability. So we've got to focus on how do we get more trained teachers? How do we start to build capacity in schools? You know, capacity building is the framework for the largest urban district in North America that's made the most progress in serving the needs of immigrant children and poor children. You know what district that is? It's Toronto. Toronto. They're not afraid of speaking another language in Toronto. They think it's a good idea. So they don't wait till high school. They start early. In Toronto, they don't think poverty is a learning disability, so they make sure there are resources in place so that teachers don't have to be social workers and psychologists. They bring in social workers and psychologists to work with children. And if a school is struggling in Toronto, they can actually call on the Ministry of Education for help, and they show up not to scrutinize, not to pressure, not to threaten, but to help, to problem solve. Every county office of education should be focused on collaborative problem solving with the districts to help them figure out how to do the work. We can't wait for the state to figure it out. You know, I'd like to point out that Toronto made its progress under a crack-smoking mayor. He just died, rest in peace. But imagine if they had a sober mayor, what they could have done. Right? I mean, if you can do it in Toronto, you can do it in California too. And so we need to make sure that we are not continuing to allow the distortions created by the past few years to continue to show up in our schools. You know what happens when you give a teacher a script? You drive out your best teachers. Because your best teachers didn't go into the profession to be told what page to be on. They go into the profession to make a difference, to use education to inspire, to motivate, to engage kids. That's what we should be focused on. Not the low-level testable skills. Skills that now are showing us that large numbers of our kids who pass the test are actually not prepared for college. That's why they're taking so many remedial courses. Right? We need to make sure that we don't use tests simply to measure and monitor, but we find ways to provide support to kids in their language. And that's why we need a framework for how to do it. And the framework for pursuing equity really draws on things we've known for years, such as the fact that children develop at a different pace, even within the same family, even identical twins. They don't do things identically. My first son walked at 9 months. I was very proud, as if I had something to do with it. The fourth one didn't walk till 15 months. I was concerned. She was crawling very well. I thought she'd crawl forever. They're all walking fine now, though. They're all over. Just because you don't achieve average yearly progress at walking, or talking, or reading, doesn't mean there's a disability. It just means there's a spectrum. Right? We do need to make sure that all children are achieving progress, that they're moving forward. But we need to understand that their journey may not all be the same. Right? The pathway for them may not all look the same. And child development reminds us of that. The neuroscience that's coming out now, the neuroscientific research, is telling us, this idea of measuring ability and making early judgments of children is completely at odds with the way the brain develops. Because the brain develops through stimulation. The brain develops through relationships, through experiences. It's elastic. It's like a muscle. It has to be worked, which is why all children need quality early childhood education. Learning experiences that stimulate the mind through play, right? Not through regimentation, right? It's the inequities we're creating now between what we give the poor children in early childhood and what the middle class and affluent are getting are striking. Visit the preschools, and you'll see it. All children have to be stimulated and encouraged and given the ability to explore. And then finally, we've got to understand what's happening in their lives outside of school, what's happening in the community, what's happening in the family. Many of our immigrant kids are not even living with their families. They're in transnational family. Mommy and papi said across the border, they're here living with relatives. We need to understand the context, especially if we're going to build strong partnerships with families, and we must build partnerships with families because the families are the first teachers. And we need the families to be the advocates for the children. So we need to understand what's happening outside of school. And we need to understand it because the more we know about how our children learn, the more we'll know about how to teach them. Right now, in too many of our schools, we expect the children to learn the way we teach. And if they can't do it, we blame them. If you're ready for it, CABE, go out there and start teaching the children the way they learn. Think about the difference. How many of you have children at home that play video games? Anybody have a child who's a gamer? Lots of gamers out there. May I have some gamers in the audience today? How does a child learn to play a video game? Did they get direct instruction? Or do they get on there and start playing? Learn by doing. How often do our kids get to learn by doing? If they struggle with that game, they might get on the phone and ask for help. We call that cheating. Our kids learn through collaboration. When they're learning the game, they make mistakes, don't they? Sometimes they die, have to start over. Are our classrooms safe for learning through your mistakes? Are mistakes seen as a part of the learning process? And the longer they play the game, what happens? They get better. They get better. They rise to a higher level. They master the game. How many of our children get to experience mastery in school? How many of our children could say, you know, I mastered the times tables. I'm ready for long division. You know? I mastered the decimals and percentages. I'm ready for algebra. You know what happens when you don't master things? You get pushed along with a weak foundation. And you can't do more advanced work because you don't have the foundation for it. If we teach the way our children learn, we teach differently. And I'm going to give you some examples of how that's happening. Examples of schools that are helping kids to utilize their higher order thinking skills that allow them to translanguage. Ofelia Garcia writes about translanguaging. You know what? That's how you actually learn a language. You use your primary language to acquire the second language. Right? That's what the brain is doing all the time. The opportunity to learn and through complex tasks and through challenging text. What are your children reading right now? Is it something that will make them want to keep reading after school? Keep reading in the summertime? That's what it should do, right? How many of you are avid readers? Anybody here an avid reader? How many of your children are avid readers? Okay, I'm glad to see some hands. My father, who did not graduate from high school, neither did my mother. They managed to send all 6 of us to college, top colleges in the country. Right? He used to tell us, you get a free education with a library card. But most people don't practice it. So we insisted that we did. So on Saturdays, after the chores, my mother would send us to the library, as if that was a daycare center. Fortunately for us, there was a Panamanian librarian named Miss McDonald who was there to greet us, and she would take time with each one of us to find out what we were interested in, and then recommend a book. In 4th grade, she recommended to me A Wrinkle in Time. Yeah, anybody who's read it says, yeah, that's a good one. I became an avid reader right then. What makes kids want to read? Good literature. What are your children reading? Are they reading literature about themselves, about their culture, about their history, so they can make sense of who they are? Are they learning about other cultures? Because that's got to be part of the experience too. My daughter, who struggled with reading till 9th grade, when she had a very patient, thoughtful teacher. We're riding the subway one day from Washington Heights downtown, and she's reading a book while we're taking the train. I see her crying. I said, what's wrong? She said, this book is so sad. I said, well, stop reading it. She said, I can't stop. I said, why not? She says, it's too good. And I said, what are you reading? She says, The Kite Runner. Oh, no wonder, right? And then she proceeded to tell me about it. We're both crying on the way down. I hadn't even read the book. It's so sad. What are we reading and what to our kids, and what are we having them read? Are we giving them the skills they really need for college? Skills like the ability to do independent research. Skills like the ability to critique what they read and see in the media, so they're not passively accepting everything thrown at them. Skills that allow them to produce high-quality work and demonstrate mastery. Demonstrate it. Produce it. We've got to demand more if we want our kids to be able to produce more. The Common Core calls for this, and if we took the time to understand the opportunities it creates, we would see that these skills that require kids to be able to apply ideas and engage in more complex text, that encourage them to be able to systematically acquire knowledge in literature and other disciplines, and develop a broad array of literacy skills, and that, in fact, give teachers the ability to choose, right? To choose what kinds of texts and what kinds of assignments. Because this is not a mandated curriculum, at least not from the federal government. It might be in your district, but that's your district's problem. Right? Still allows lots of flexibility to meet the needs of our children. Here's what's possible when you do it right. Brockton High School. Brockton High School is the largest high school in the state of Massachusetts, 4,200 students. Massachusetts is the top performing state in the country. For 6 years in a row, Over 1/3 of the senior class at Brockton High School has gotten the highest possible score on the state exam, which gives them a free scholarship at any public university. And you know what's impressive about that? 70% of those kids were English language learners. 100% of those kids. 100% low income. Brockton is the only urban high school in the state that gets a level 1 rating by the state. It's a poor, working class community. It's known for fighting. That's what it's known for. You Google, you'll find out they had a brawl at their last graduation. Right? Rocky Marciano, the boxer, came from Brockton, so there's a boxer out front. They like to fight in Brockton, but they also like to write in Brockton. That's what they do. Because the secret to their success is what? Literacy across the curriculum. Every teacher, regardless of what they teach, is a teacher of literacy. The science teacher, the math teacher, the art teacher, the PE teacher even, trained on how to meet the needs of the children, how to develop their literacy skills. In 1998, when the school was about to take the high-stakes exams, a group of teachers went to the principal and said, the only way our students can pass these exams is if every teacher is trained in their discipline to develop the literacy skills of students. The principal said, that's a great idea, but I can't make the teachers do it. They said, let's work with the willing. We don't have to wait till everybody says yes. He said, well, I can't pay you. He said, we'll work on our own time. We will work and train each other in a very unionized state, unionized district. By 2002, 50% of the kids were passing, which was a victory because they expected 75% to fail. So they stuck with it. They didn't move on to a new technique, a new gimmick. They said, no, literacy works. By 2006, 80%. Since 2010, over 90% of the students passed the state exam. There are no gimmicks. There are no gimmicks. We've got to really ask ourselves, are we organizing our staff to meet the needs of the kids? At Brockton, they didn't sit around blaming the middle schools, say, oh, those middle schools keep sending us these unprepared kids. They said, let's meet the kids where they are and organize ourselves to address the needs. I can't tell you when I go to a school where they're blaming the kids and blaming the parents. Right? Our parents are sending us their best kids, aren't they? Oh, I got to go fast. Okay. So the math standards also, they call for some different things. They call for us to support the ability for students to learn and apply math and concepts and procedures outside of math even. They call us to real-world issues and challenges. They call for problem-solving, collaboration, communication, interwoven into the standards. What does it look like when you get it right? Whoa, look at this classroom. In East LA, Hollenbeck Middle School. Woohoo, East LA, right? So who are these kids? These are all English language learners. These are all recent immigrants. They're in an 8th grade algebra class, 90 minutes long. And they're up out of their seats. And the teacher's so good, she can stand in the back and talk to me. Because she doesn't have to hover. She doesn't have to control them because the children are in control. They're empowered as learners, which means they're not just learning math, right? They are learning to problem solve. They are learning to work together. They are learning impulse control. This is the highest form of classroom management known. It's called academic engagement. Now, let's be clear. She didn't start this way in September, did she? No. She had to establish the norm. She had to know who was who. She knows that this one can't sit next to that one because he has a crush on her. They can't be together, right? This is middle school. She knows learning has to be fun in middle school, right? Otherwise, they're going to make it fun at your expense, right? And because she's got them working together, you know what she gets to do? She gets to differentiate support. She gets to move amongst them and see who needs help, who's on task, who can work together and who can't. Who are your teachers that know how to do this? Who are your teachers that know how to move away from the cemetery method of teaching? You know the cemetery method? Line them up in rows, keep them as still as possible. Deadly, isn't it? Especially for the children. Sometimes deadly for the teachers too, because the kids usually don't want any part of it. So we've got to figure out, how do we create classrooms? How do we create schools where English language learners, students with learning disabilities, are not languishing in classrooms with teachers that can't meet the needs? I can't tell you if I go to school where they're out in a bungalow out back, right, with some stressed out, inexperienced teacher, right? And then we're wondering why they're making no progress. There are support services that must be made available to these kids. There's got to be training for the teachers. There's got to be fidelity in the IEP. There's got to be teachers with support services. I'm sorry, I'm rushing through. I only have like a minute. But this is what it looks like when you get it right. This is the Bronx Academy of Language and Technology in New York. I'm naming the schools so you can visit them, okay? Because it's the proof that it can be done is the existence of these schools. Right? The problem is not the children. The problem is the way we treat the children. Okay? At this school, 50% of the kids are undocumented. All of the students are SIFE students, students with interrupted formal education. That means they weren't attending school regularly in their native countries, so they're not literate in their primary language. These children drop out in higher numbers than any other group of kids. 95% of them will graduate from that high school, with 6 or more regions in English as well. Now, some of them will be 21, almost 22 by the time they graduate, because their focus is on meeting the needs, not on keeping them according to some sequence of when you're supposed to do this. I asked the students, what makes a school like this work? You know what they tell me? It feels like a family. We all support each other. We're in this together. I asked the teachers, what makes it possible for you to succeed here? I sat in as I watched teachers plan their lessons together. No lesson is put out to in a classroom unless it's been vetted by a senior teacher first. A new teacher turned to me and says, don't all teachers do this? I said, no, they don't. He said, well, I don't know what I would do if they just put me in a classroom because I don't know what the hell I'm doing anyway. I'm glad I have this support. What are we doing to support the teachers? Blaming the teachers is not a strategy for improvement, okay? Any more than threatening the schools. We've got to learn from examples of success. Those examples are out there. We've got to focus on getting our kids engaged. If CABE is ready, go out there and tell your colleagues, we need to stop focusing on achievement. Achievement as measured by the test score, that's the outcome, maybe. That's only one indicator. You know, if you wanted to lose weight, I'm not saying you need to lose weight, but if you wanted to lose weight, would you focus on getting the best scale possible? And weigh yourself as often as you could? Or would you focus on the diet and the exercise? Focusing on engagement is the means through which we get better outcomes. We've got to look at the outcomes, all the outcomes. Can they write? Can they read? Can they problem solve? But we've got to focus on the process to get there. And we got to keep in mind engagement is multidimensional, it's behavioral, it's cognitive, and it's emotional. We got to get the kids to want it, right? What did Jaime Escalante impart to his students? Ganas, the desire to learn. I was, you know, when he died just as they announced the failure of an experiment run out of Harvard where they were paying kids for higher test scores, paying kids to read, paying kids to go to school. Right? This was another Eli Broad experiment. Right? Meanwhile, Escalante dies, and there's this outpouring of former students who come out, engineers, doctors, lawyers, all from East LA, all coming out of Garfield High. I met one of them. She's an assistant superintendent in Inglewood. She said, everything you hear about Escalante is true. He was my teacher. She said, he used to come to my soccer games. I said, he came to your games? She said, yeah, but not to cheer for me. He would tell me I can't play soccer, I should go back to math. What are we doing to inspire our kids? What are we doing to get them to realize that knowledge is power and that through education, not only can they change their lives, they can change the world. That's what's at stake. We can't wait for the politicians to come around and to what we should do. We can't wait for permission. We've got to do what's right now. I believe that California is on the cusp of change. I believe it because of what the energy I feel in the room today. But each of us has to go back into our schools, ready to continue to instigate the changes around us. If no more than in our classrooms, start there. Bring your classroom to life. Get your children excited about learning. so that they feel the power too. I believe that education is the way to create a more equal and just society. And I believe that people like you are going to make it happen. Thank you.